Hello and welcome to Hexed Encountered. My name is Joe. Today I'm going to be doing a first look at the game by Iron and Blood, the Battle of Königgrätz from July 3rd, 1866. This is from the Austro-Prussian War, and this is published by White Dog Games, designed by Hermann Luttmann, with development by Fred Manzo and art by Ilya Kudryashov. So this is a fairly new game, came out a few months ago, and it is a potential start of a series. It is a new system. If you aren't aware, Hermann Luttmann is the man behind the Blind Sword system, which is in the double digits now in terms of games in that series, and most of them are American Civil War. But the system is very much designed for that kind of early, late 19th century, the basically, middle 1850s or so through like the 1880s, I would guess, in terms of, the kind of the transition from the whole Napoleonic, the Napoleonic tactics meeting the, the technology of the Industrial Revolution, and the creation of much more efficient weaponry and so on and so forth, which was, a big part of obviously several wars, the American Civil War being by far the one most familiar to Americans, of course. But there were, two big wars fought in Europe after the American Civil War, one being the Austro-Prussian War and the other being the Franco-Prussian War, that basically led to the formation of the Second German Empire, the Second Reich. And so this one was a big part of that kind of, the rise of the Prussian hegemony over Germany in general, because Austria and Prussia were by far the two most powerful German states before the unification of Germany. And those two wars basically cemented Prussia's leading role in the creation of what became modern Germany. So enough of the pseudo history lesson there, and let's talk about this game. So as I mentioned, this is a new system. Does not use chit pull. That's a common theme in some of Hermann Luttmann's other games, such as the Blind Sword series, Shattered Union, and Black Swan. Those all use chit pulls and variations thereof. This is completely different. This has a really interesting new mechanic. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But let's look at the components. So as I mentioned, this is from White Dog Games. It is printed by Blue Panther. So if you are familiar with any of the other companies that work with Blue Panther, of which there are a decent number actually, so the components will all look very familiar with that. So here it is, the back of the box. It tells you what comes with the game. This is a two-player game. It says time to play 4 hours. Solitaire suitability, 4 out of 10. We'll talk about that. Complexity, 6 out of 10. And it's for ages 12 and up. I feel like these numbers are pretty much dead on. The game can be soloed, but I would say it's a much more... it's probably a great two-player game, let's put it that way. And it's a good solitaire game, in my opinion. It can be soloed, but you lose some of the nuances in the mechanics that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So you get a look kind of at the counters and the map and the cards, and then a description of, what this was. As I mentioned, it's the Austro-Prussian War. This is it's the final decisive battle of that war. This was the Battle of Königgrätz, as the Germans would say it, or Sadova, if you wish. And it occurred on July 3rd, 1866, and was the largest European land engagement fought between the Battle of Leipzig and the mammoth battles of the First World War. So this was a pretty large battle. It involved over 450,000 men from multiple European nations and principalities. The battle would decide the destiny of Europe, determining whether Prussia or Austria would be the dominant force binding the various German states together to form a new potential superpower that would be born with a united Germany. So the Prussians were led by General Helmuth von Moltke, who is a fairly famous name in military history. And they invaded Austria in late June of 1866 with 3 armies, each following a separate axis of advance. Using divergent approaches was risking defeat in detail, but Moltke counted on superior Prussian maneuverability to outflank the Austrian North Army under Feldzuchmeister Ludwig von Benedek, no T on the end there. Battles were fought at Nachod, Trachtenau, Skalitz, Sohr, and Gitschen, with the Prussians prevailing in nearly all these encounters. The demoralized Austrians gathered their remaining strength in front of the fortress of Königgrätz, hoping that one last titanic defensive battle would win them the war. The Prussians rushed ahead with the First and Elbe armies, engaging the Austrians in their prepared positions. Prussian commanders then looked to the north for the approaching Second Army, hoping it would arrive in time to deliver the killing blow. But where was that army, and how long would it take to deploy effectively to the battlefield? The race was on. Could the North Army defeat the outnumbered Prussians before a Second Army closed the vise, or would the war end under the walls of Königgrätz? So let's take a look inside the box. That whole Second Army thing is a very important part of the game, as it was a very important part of the battle. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. But let's look at the components first. So we do have our deck of cards. There are 27. There are 9 event cards for the Prussians, 9 event cards for the Austrians, and 9 cards that help kind of manage the arrival of the Second Army, the Prussian Second Army. Because when the battle began, the Prussian First Army was taking on the Austrian North Army and was outnumbered. So the Second Army's arrival was a key part of Prussia being able to win the battle. So here we have our Prussian event cards. There are, as I said, 9 of them, I believe. Yes. And basically you draw these. You can hold them. Eventually you could have all of them. You play them out. They go into a discard pile, and they can be pulled back into your hand later. Austrian event cards. There are also 9 of these. Similar setup here. The colors obviously are a little different, and the events themselves are also different. So this one here is an important one for the Austrian player, because it allows you to delay, well, maybe not delay, but allows you to impact how the Second Army forces arrive. And I am going to talk about that. I'm going to try to talk about the mechanics a little bit as part of this video, so that when I do a playthrough video, I won't have to concentrate so much on mechanics, and things can move a little bit more quickly. The video I did before this one on Our God Was My Shield, I kind of got bogged down in talking about mechanics as part of the playthrough, because I didn't do a first look video, and I should have, in hindsight, done a first look video where I could talk about that stuff, as opposed to trying to do some kind of combination. So this card is just obviously an extra card, but here are our Second Army arrival. You can see there are numbers on here, and we'll talk about what these numbers mean here in a bit. Okay, so here is our rule book. There is no dice. There are no dice, I should say, with this game. You'll need either 2 or 4, depending on if you want both sides to have their own dice. But you'll need 2 in different colors, black and white, let's say, to play. But there is no dice. Again, I say is. There are no dice. Really, English is my first language. There are no dice in the box. Okay. So here's our rule book. It is 12 pages long. The print is relatively small, but not tiny, I guess. It is a little small. I do wear glasses when I read. I have reached that age, unfortunately. But there are some good examples in here to kind of go through, to kind of highlight and give play examples and so on and so forth. You can see the units, and they explain what all of the, what the symbols and numbers on the counter mean, as you would expect. That's in here. You have your unit ID, and then their formation, right? Their commanding headquarters, basically. So on the one side, you'll have Austrian and Saxon forces, and on the other side, you have Prussian forces, basically. And so, as we'll see, the components vary a little bit. And by components, I'm talking about not only the event cards, but also things like the player aid card, which contains the two. There are two CRTs, basically one for fire combat, one for assault combat, and they vary a bit between the two. There's also something called the TE rating, which is training and experience. And as you might expect, if you know your history, the Prussian army was very well trained and led. And so their TE rating is marginally, in many cases at least, marginally better than that of the Austrians and the Saxons. Which can be, it's a small difference, but it can be a crucial difference, as you will see when we get into the combat mechanics. So for fire combat, there are two different numbers here. This number here on the left is basically your regular fire combat, like rifles, etc. And then the one on the right is the artillery firepower. So unlike, say, blind swords, the units in this series or this game, because it's not yet a series, but I believe Hermann is hoping this can become a series if it does well enough. So the idea is that each of these units, because they're larger, they have their own integral artillery with them. So these are big units. They're not regiments or anything like that. They're bigger units. So they'll all have inherent cannons and so on and so forth. They have their own inherent artillery forces. And cavalry and artillery type units may only issue fire combat using their artillery fire SP value. And then there's the artillery value for infantry units will come into play when they are attacked in assault combat. So we'll see. We'll mention that as well. Then you have different types of infantry units, like the Austrians have Jaegers. So if they have a green box around the SP value, which is what these guys are, these are both Jaeger units. There is also heavy cavalry. Prussian heavy cavalry will have a white box, and the Austrian heavy cavalry will have a black box around their SPs. That's their strength points. You have fresh and battle-worn sides. That's similar to what you would see in the blind sword system. Basically, it's like a full strength and a reduced side, essentially. There are also shaken and disrupted. One side will be shaken, the other side of the counter is disrupted, which will impact. Shaken will impact your training and experience rating. And the disrupted will actually also have your strength points, because you're, pretty beat up, basically. There are markers. You have HQs, and so on and so forth. Let's take a step back from talking about mechanics for a bit and just kind of go through the rest of the components here. So we do have, if I can get it out of the box, we have this, which kind of details your sequence of play. So you have your moves. You move your game turn marker, determine the command points. So this is where the whole chit pull thing, which it doesn't exist in here. Instead, you have command points, and it's a really clever system. If you're familiar with a mechanic called the Rivers system, which I think was in like a Batman game or something, Hermann has adapted that into a war game, and it works. It works pretty well. It's an interesting mechanic. It really is. So you determine your command points, which is going to be 8 for both sides, but the Prussians will get 10 once the Second Army shows up. Well, once the Second Army's HQ shows up, I should say. You draw your event cards. Prussians get 3. The Austrians draw 2. Initiative, you roll a die. You can spend a command point to give yourself a +2 DRM. The high roll gains initiative. If you roll doubles, you get dominant initiative, which means you can activate 2. And then you have a tie, which would be a lull on the battlefield, and both sides lose 3 CPs and you have to re-roll. So that there's some interesting things in here with your command points, which are extremely important. Activation phase, you'll activate formations just like you would in, say, Blind Swords. The difference being you spend CPs to do it, and you have a CP track, which we'll see because it's right here. We'll see in a moment. And the CP has a cost per unit. So there's some strategy involved in how you place your units for CP cost to activate them. Then you'll go through and do fire, movement, assault, rally, reset. We'll talk about reset in a moment. The rest of these are fairly familiar in terms of, things that exist in other games, obviously. You do fire first, then movement, then assault. That stuff is all pretty straightforward and familiar if you've played other games that Hermann has designed. The system is pretty similar to that. Then at the end of turn, you'll check for the second army arrival. It comes in kind of piecemeal, a little bit at a time, using the points that are on these cards. So basically, the Prussian player will build up a bank of arrival number points and can spend those to bring in second army units. So that's how that works. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So let's put this aside for a moment. So this here needs to be cut in 2 pieces because each side has 1. So here we have the Prussian formation command point cost track. So as I mentioned, you're going to put your units in here, and it's kind of strategic. And in the two-player game, which is why you get that 4 rating for solitaire, because this can be hidden information in a 2-player game where your opponent won't know, and you won't know your opponent's layout on here, because this is kind of very strategic in terms of you want to put units that you think you're going to activate early, kind of in the low area, and then the ones that you might do later on will start here, and then they kind of move down the track. That's the river part of it, right? They'll kind of move down and get cheaper as you go through, and then eventually you run out of command points and you won't be able to activate anybody anymore. And there's ways to activate multiple, or not multiple. Well, you can activate 2 if you roll doubles on your initiative roll to get dominant initiative. That'll let you activate 2. Or you can use your HQ and stack it with a unit in one of these boxes, and that would allow you to activate either the units it's stacked with or the ones on either side of it. So this very, very good strategy stuff in the way this is the most important mechanic in the game, is understanding this piece of it, is how and when to optimally activate your units. That's really important in terms of how this game works. So obviously both sides have it. You have to just kind of cut it out, or cut it in half. Give your Prussian player 1, your Austrian player the other one, and that's your track. This is obviously one-sided, as is this one. But this is a good one because it goes through everything for you, and it explains what happens when you get a pushed back result or a shaken result in combat, disrupted, broken, how retreats work. This is really good because it kind of encapsulates the rules onto a 1-page sheet. The rules aren't overly complex, but this is also not an overly simple game. You do have to understand how things work and how the rules work and so on and so forth. So here we have the Austrian player aid. So this is for Austrian and Saxon forces. And you can see the FF means firefight. So this basically doesn't do any damage, but it causes an attack by your opponent, which is kind of a neat thing. And this can go back and forth, because say you're the Austrians and you do an attack and your total firing SP is 8 and you roll a 22. So you're here. Then the Prussians are going to get to attack you back. And maybe they have a strength of 6 and they roll a 15. And so they're going to then give you the opportunity to fire back. So it's going to go back and forth, potentially. Eventually, someone's going to roll high enough that it'll either be no effect, which is the dashes, or PB is pushed back, SH is shaken, DS is disrupted. There is also broken, which is not on here. You can't really break a unit for either side through this regular fire combat. You have to basically assault them to do that. You have column shifts. You have ranged fire. Infantry can only fire from an adjacent hex. The artilleries have different ranges. The Austrians can also have a little bit extra range here, 5 hexes, if they are entrenched. Because the Austrians obviously knew the Prussians were coming. They built, prepared positions, entrenchments, had their guns ranged in and ready because they knew the Prussians were coming, and they figured these were the most likely avenues of approach. Let's get those locked in with our guns so they can range out to 5 hexes. Then you also have smoothbore artillery and other artillery as well. The key, which I basically just told you. Then we have our column shifts. If the Austrian infantry is firing because the Austrian weaponry wasn't as effective, the Saxons had better rifles, and the Prussians had even better rifles than the Saxons. So the Austrian rifles are going to be the least effective, so they get a column shift to the left. The Saxons, no column shift. The Prussians would have even more firepower. Then you have things like elevation, range, whether or not it's cavalry on the target, if you're in a town or heavy woods. And then you talk about training and equipment. So all of that stuff can factor in. If you roll doubles, it triggers this thing where you can get an extra CP. And if you roll doubles again, you would get an extra event card. And then that can repeat and repeat and repeat throughout the turn. There is a counter to mark where you are, so that if you roll doubles, you'll know whether or not you get a CP or an event card. On the back, you have the assault combat result table. So this is kind of, first of all, the red will tell you if the defender or the attacker wins the combat. So that who wins the hex, right? Then you'll have things that'll tell you what happens, like a BR is a broken. DS, just like on the other side, is a disruption. SH is a shaken. But you'll also see over here, you'll have BR, those are broken. And again, you have the key down here. We again have column shifts. You have the ability to do a cavalry charge as well. Cavalry was still, it was on its way out. Modern weaponry would make literal mincemeat of cavalry charges as time goes on. Even though cavalry was still around at the beginning of the First World War, it was definitely on its way out by this time. There was obviously the famous death charge by the Prussians at the Battle of Mars-la-Tour, which was, 5 years later during the Franco-Prussian War. But cavalry still charged. That's the point I'm trying to make in my own wordy way here. We have assault combat rules down here, etc., etc. So very, very well laid out, detailed, perfect. We have our Austrian player aid card. This will tell you your setup instructions and your setup for your forces. These are where the hex numbers where all your forces will go. Event cards, this explains what each event card does. On the back, we have the basically your orders. You have to give your formation an order when you activate it. Makes sense. You can march, which gives you a movement bonus, but prevents you from doing any combat. Then you have engage, which obviously sets you up to do fire combat. Assault would set you up to assault. And then you have regroup, which is kind of like a rally. Not kind of like, it is a rally, basically. Movement, it tells you the movement ability or movement range, right, for each unit, because it's not on the counters. Movement's not on the counters because all the units have various MA, movement allowances. And then you have movement costs, so your terrain effects. The map is very, very, I haven't seen it yet, but you'll see it momentarily. The map is very, very well laid out, as you would expect. The terrain is very clear. You know exactly what you're looking at. So it's really, really well done. Then we have the Prussians, right? It's the same thing, except this, well, let's look at the fire combat first. These look mostly the same. They're very close to each other, but column shifts, all this stuff is basically the same. There are some subtle differences. And so you can see that there's no thing here about reducing or shifting for rifles for your infantry units, because that's kind of baked in. The fact that the Russians had their needle guns, or Prussians rather, had their needle guns. Sorry. So that's pretty much the same. This is also pretty much the same, again, slightly different because of the basically the The difference is in the armies. But as far as it being laid out, it's laid out exactly the same. The red will tell you who won. The black will tell you what happens. Then they have their own Prussian command card, except they also, in addition to your movement and terrain effects, they have the Prussian Second Army arrival schedule. So 5AN, that's the arrival number. So again, if we look at our arrival cards, let's say you pull a 4, and then later on you pull a 2. You have 6. You know this, the Austrians do not. The Austrian player does not. But with 6, you can activate this first unit here because it costs 5. And then you can put them in any of these 3 hexes, 1301, 1401, or 1501. It's really straightforward, really well done. Again, on the other side, you have your event card breakdown. You have your setup for all your forces. This is your first army, because the second army comes in, as I mentioned, piecemeal and driven by your second army arrival cards. And then game setup notes. All right, now we have our counter sheet. So here's the counter sheet. One counter sheet. So again, these are fairly large formations. There's 42 on each side because I counted them up. And you have a bunch of markers as well. The shaken, and on the other side you'll have disrupted. Command points for both sides. Both sides have it. This is the Prussian. This is the Austrian. This is your doubles bonus I was talking about. You can see this one gives you the command point. On the other side gives you the draw card for an event card. Right? You have your game turn marker, obviously. Victory point markers. Whoops, I'm popping them out here. Headquarters for the various units. Color coded. This is all kind of similar to what you would expect in like a blind swords game. And then the colors match up. So 4th Corps, here's the 4th Corps units, right? They have these 4 infantry plus 1 cavalry. The Reserve Corps has all of these guys. Elba Army is these guys here. It's really straightforward. The coloration will tell you as well. This is 1st Army, and these guys down here are 2nd Army. On the Austrian side, this is the Austrian Army, and these are the Saxons. So this is, as I mentioned, this is the stacking points. You can have 2 per hex. So this one would have to be by itself, but these 2 could be together because they only have 1 each. And commensurately, as you would expect, their strength numbers, their SP numbers are lower. Like these 2 together make 11. This guy by himself is 12. The black circle with the number, that's your TE rating, which I mentioned earlier, but I don't know if I specifically said that it was, where it was on the counter. And then, as mentioned earlier, strength point and artillery strength point. Pretty straightforward. So let's get to the map. So the game obviously comes with a map. And I'm going to show the whole map, so don't anybody get offended here. But it's a paper map, okay? Here is the titular location of Königgrätz. And over here is Sedova for the alternate name for the battle. Okay, so here we have our canvas map. This is really well done. I really like this. Blue Panther also does, I'm going to digress for a second. Blue Panther also does games by the Historical Game Company as well as a bunch of others. Hollandspiele, etc. There's a whole bunch of them. Catastrophe games, Shoots games. There's more. There's several others. And I'm drawing a blank right now. So I don't want to leave anybody out on purpose. So I'm just going to say that's all I'm going to say right now. Anyway, canvas map. I played the Siege of Port Arthur from the Historical Game Company. Really like that. Really like the map. It's very cool. Now it does have a crease in it. It's new, right? But it's so flexible, and you can easily kind of roll it to decrease the crease, essentially, right? Just kind of roll it a little bit, and the crease becomes a little bit more, a little less noticeable over time. I mean, you kind of lay it out and flatten it out, but it's pretty flat right now, and it's not like the counters are gonna slide around or anything. It's really nice. I really like the canvas map. So anyway, I opted to buy this. This cost $20, I think, extra over the cost of the game, but I really like it. So that is why I went with that. Now, I mentioned I was going to talk about how things work, and I kind of did as we went along. So just a few other things to mention here with the map. You see yellow victory point locations, mainly centered in here, but also a couple down here to the south. This is north, south, west, and east, as you might expect. I don't think there's actually a compass rose on this map, but basically that's what it is. That's the north. So regular map orientation, so to speak. You have your victory point track over here, and your game turn track over here. It's all July 3rd, 1866. So you start at 8 a.m. and the battle ends at 7 p.m. Basically covers your daylight hours, essentially. Maybe. Mostly, at least. So you do have victory point locations. The yellow ones are victory locations for both sides. Then over here we have some green ones. Here, these two, and this one, which are victory points only for the Prussians. The Prussians start over here, and the Austrians start, basically on the east side. So the Prussians are going to come in this way from the kind of the northwest and drive in this direction towards Königgrätz and try to capture as much of this as possible. You see some entrenchments here, fortifications for the Austrians. This is high ground. The lighter color is lowest level. The darkest color, which would be these here and these, are the highest level. All of these are considered heavy woods. There's one light woods hex. It's right here in the Hohlewald. The rest of these are basically heavy forest, as I said. You have two major rivers, the Elbe, which is here, and the Bistrich, which is here, and then a couple of minor things. You Trottina Brook over here, and this one, I don't think this one has a name on it. I don't see it anyway. So you have a couple streams, basically. Major road, and the dotted lines are minor roads. Obviously, you have towns. You have one special bridge here that is very rickety. The Saxons damaged it, and it can actually basically clog this crossing for a whole turn. If you have to roll when you cross it, and unless you're retreating, you can retreat across it without rolling. But if you're attempting to cross it, by movement, voluntary movement, you have to roll for it, and the bridge can become basically disabled and clogged up for a turn. That's just this one bridge over the Bistrich River. You cannot, in most cases, cross the river. Infantry, I think, can cross it if they use all of their movement. Like if they were here, they could cross it, but they become disrupted by doing so, and it uses all their movement allowance. So typically you want to cross these rivers at the bridges. So there are plenty of bridges, obviously. We got, one here, one here, one here, and then a couple up here. And then you have, several bridges across the Elbe down here. We have two automatic victory locations. One is here. They're marked with eagles. So we have our Prussian eagle here. If the Prussian captures this hex, they automatically win. If the Austrian captures this hex, they automatically win. So that is pretty much, I think, what I was going to do as far as talking about the game in this first look video. As I mentioned, I like to try to kind of mix in talking about mechanics and so on and so forth, so that when I do a playthrough video, I don't have to go as far in depth. Because I'm going to assume that you watched this, and I'm going to recommend that you watch this if you haven't watched it before you watch the playthrough video. I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's the way I kind of look at it. So I'm going to wrap this up for now. Hopefully you can see how the components are laid out. It's typical Blue Panther components, which are very good. They're nice. The counters, I didn't really talk about this, but the counters are nice and thick. If you watched my previous video on Our God Was My Shield, which is from Hollandspiele, also prints with Blue Panther, same quality of components. It's really very nice. They're thick. They get some like center nibs on them, but nothing nothing horrible. And, you know, everything, the cards are nice. These are regular, you know, good quality cards. They're not a linen finish or anything, but they're very nice. You might want to sleeve them maybe, but they're really good. The map, as I mentioned, I love the canvas map. I do have the paper map as well, but I'm going to play on the canvas map because I paid extra to get it. So that will do it. I will be back with a playthrough video on this game. I think this system is really interesting, the rivers system, and I do want to show how that kind of works and talk about, which I didn't really talk about that much in this, is with the way the CP works, you know, the command points, it adds fog of war because the opponent won't know what order you're trying to activate. And you can be a little bit flexible in there depending on if you want to activate someone who costs more CP than less, which allows you to kind of be situationally flexible. It could cost you extra, it will cost you extra CP to do so, but you do have that kind of flexibility to be able to do so, which is a good thing. But that's, to me, that's the main thing that makes this better as well, that and the second army part, where you draw, the Prussian draws cards here, and he's going to get a certain number of points, or AN, and you use those to bring your second army onto the map. Now, the Austrian, as I mentioned at the very beginning, has this card, Finkenstein delayed second army staff problems, which will make the, so you play this after the Prussian draws a card, because the Prussian draws this card, and you don't, the Austrian player doesn't know what it is. He's not shown it. They don't know what it is. Okay? You look at that drawn card, and you may force the Prussian player to draw a new card to replace it. So it's kind of blind. You're hoping he didn't draw 0, because that's, you know, better for the Prussian if they get to draw another card. If they drew a 0. If they drew a 4, which there's only one 4, then that's a bummer because they don't get the points for it. It gets shuffled back into the deck. So it's not like it's gone. So if you pull this, and you're the Prussian, and the Austrian drops this on you, you're like, oh, crap. But it goes right back in. You just shuffle it back into the deck. But you don't get to have it in there, because 4 gets you almost all the way to being able to have enough to pull in your first unit. So the Prussian must then draw a new card, and then the originally drawn card, as I said, is shuffled back into the draw pile. And they all also have this spontaneous fire. So you can play it kind of like in some of your CDG games. You know, the whole Mark Herman Volko system where you have the play for an event, play for operations kind of thing. You can do a spontaneous fire. All of these have that on there. So you select one unit counter and may conduct an immediate fire combat. So if you need to have somebody shoot at somebody, you can use this. You can play a card to get that done. So you still have that kind of strategic decision, which again plays to the strength of a 2-player game of, do I want to play this or do I want to do this kind of thing? And you'll have that over and over again. And all of these cards, the events are all useful. So you have to weigh in the balance. Is it more useful for me to hold this event card, or do I really want to fire at somebody right now? So that's a neat thing too. Very well done game, as you would expect from Hermann Luttmann and Fred Manzo. That team does great work together. The map is beautiful. You know, Ilya's work is always really solid. No complaints at all component-wise with this game, and I really am looking forward to getting it played and showing you guys how it plays. So that's going to do it for now. As always, please consider liking, sharing, and/or subscribing. If you would, I would appreciate it. But my name is Joe. This has been Hexed Encountered, and until next time, happy gaming.